The blade pressed cold against Carolyn Johnson's throat as she knelt in the castle courtyard, her wedding dress torn and muddied from the chaos that had erupted moments before. Lord Raymond Carter stood behind her, his grip iron on her shoulder, while his men held the assembled wedding guests at sword point. The knight she had chosen over Carter's hand-picked suitor lay motionless near the altar, blood pooling beneath his dark armor. "You defied me for the last time," Carter hissed in her ear, his breath hot against her neck. "Watch what happens to those who cross the lord of this domain." But Carolyn's eyes were fixed on the fallen knight, Donald Kim, whose chest still rose and fell in shallow breaths. Even unconscious and bleeding, he looked like sin incarnate atop his warhorse. Just as he had the first day she'd seen him ride through the castle gates. His dark hair fell across a face that spoke of battles won and losses endured, and something in her chest tightened at the thought that her choice might have killed him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard stones, and Carolyn could hear the whispers of the crowd behind her. Some called her foolish for rejecting Carter's arrangement. Others murmured prayers for the knight who had dared to stand against their lord's will. But none of them understood the fire that had burned in her chest when she'd first laid eyes on Donald Kim, or the way her heart had hammered when he'd looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and asked if she would choose her own fate. Now, with steel at her throat and her champion fallen, Carolyn wondered if defiance had been worth the price they would all pay. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, autumn rain had drummed against the castle windows as Carolyn stared out at the muddy courtyard below. Lord Carter had summoned her that morning with news that would change everything. Her father's debts, accumulated through years of poor harvests and bad investments, had finally come due. The choice was simple: marry Carter's chosen suitor, Jack Hernandez, a wealthy merchant from the neighboring province, or watch her family lose everything they had left. "The arrangement is generous," Carter had said, his thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Hernandez will pay your father's debts and provide a comfortable life for you." Many women would consider themselves fortunate. Carolyn had nodded and curtsied, playing the part of the obedient daughter, but inside she felt something crack and crumble. At 23, she had already seen too many women disappear into marriages that consumed them whole. Her own mother had withered away in such a union, growing smaller and quieter with each passing year until she seemed to fade entirely from existence. "When will the wedding take place, my lord?" she had asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. 3 months hence, when the roads clear for spring travel. Hernandez will arrive with his retinue to claim his bride." Carter's pale eyes had studied her face. "I trust you understand the importance of this union, Lady Johnson. Your family's future depends upon your cooperation." The dismissal had been clear, and Carolyn had retreated to her chambers to contemplate a future that felt like a cage closing around her. She had always known that marriage would likely be arranged, but she had harbored secret hopes that she might have some say in the matter. Now those hopes lay shattered like glass on stone. The first time she saw Donald Kim, he was leading a column of battle-weary knights through the castle gates. Their armor bore the scars of recent conflict, and their faces held the hollow look of men who had seen too much death. But the knight at their head commanded attention in a way that made Carolyn's breath catch in her throat. He sat his destrier like he had been born in the saddle, moving with fluid grace despite the weight of his mail and plate. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, giving his face a dangerous cast that should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself pressing closer to the window, studying the way he carried himself with quiet confidence and unmistakable strength. When he dismounted in the courtyard below, she could see that he was taller than most men, with broad shoulders and the lean build of a warrior who had earned his reputation through skill rather than brute force. Something about him seemed to pull at her, as if he carried secrets in the shadows of his gray eyes. "Who is that knight?" she asked her maid, Amy Kim, who had joined her at the window. Amy squinted down at the courtyard. "That would be Sir Donald Kim, my lady. They say he's Lord Carter's new captain of guards. Brought in from the borderlands where the fighting has been fierce. Word is he's never lost a battle, but he's not much for conversation." "What else do they say about him?" "That he's dangerous Amy replied with a meaningful look. The kind of man mothers warn their daughters about. They call him the Black Knight, not for his armor, but for his reputation. Some say he's killed more men than he can count. Carolyn watched as Donald Kim supervised the care of the horses, his movements efficient and purposeful. There was something magnetic about his presence, something that made her want to know more about the man behind the fearsome reputation. Over the following days, she found herself making excuses to walk through parts of the castle where she might glimpse him. She learned that he rose before dawn to train in the practice yard, that he spoke little but listened carefully, and that the other knights respected him despite his outsider status. There was a loneliness about him that called to something deep in her chest. Their first actual encounter came by accident 2 weeks after his arrival. Carolyn had been walking in the castle gardens, seeking solitude to think about her approaching marriage, when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with a wall of mail and muscle. "Forgive me, my lady," Donald Kim said, his voice deeper than she had imagined. He stepped back immediately, giving her space, but not before she caught a hint of his scent, leather and steel, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "The fault is mine, Sir Donald. I was not watching where I walked." She looked up into his gray eyes and felt something electric pass between them. "I hope you are settling well into your new position." "Well enough." His gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer than propriety demanded. "The castle is different from the borderlands." "In what way?" "Quieter, more civilized." There was something in his tone that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with civilization. "Though I suspect that has its own dangers." Before she could ask what he meant, he bowed formally and continued on his way, leaving her standing in the garden with her heart racing and her thoughts in chaos. That night, she lay awake wondering what it would be like to know a man like Donald Kim, to see past the armor and reputation to whatever lay beneath. As winter deepened, Carolyn found herself seeking out opportunities to speak with the enigmatic knight. Their conversations were brief and formal, but she began to sense depths in him that others missed. He had a sharp intelligence that he kept carefully hidden, and occasionally she caught glimpses of something that might have been humor in his dark eyes. One evening she encountered him in the castle library, an unexpected place to find a warrior. He was studying a book of military tactics by candlelight, his scarred fingers tracing diagrams of battlefield formations. "Do you read often, Sir Donald?" she asked, settling into a chair across from him. He looked up, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before he composed himself. "When duty permits." "Knowledge of strategy has kept me alive longer than sword skill alone." "What else do you read?" "History, philosophy, when I can find it." He closed the book and leaned back in his chair. "What brings you to the library so late, my lady?" "Escape," she said honestly. "Sometimes I need to lose myself in other worlds, other possibilities." Something shifted in his expression, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "And what worlds do you prefer?" "Stories of adventure, tales of people who choose their own paths, regardless of what others expect of them." She met his gaze directly. "Do you think such freedom truly exists, Sir Donald?" "For some," he said carefully, "though it often comes at a price few are willing to pay." "What price would that be?" "Loneliness, exile, the knowledge that you can never truly belong anywhere." His voice carried the weight of personal experience. "Freedom is not always as appealing as it appears in stories." Carolyn studied his face in the candlelight, seeing past the scar and the stern expression to something vulnerable beneath. "Perhaps loneliness is preferable to a cage, even a comfortable one." "Perhaps." He opened the book again, but she sensed his attention remained on her. "Though cages come in many forms, my lady, sometimes we build them ourselves." Their conversations became a lifeline for Carolyn as her wedding date approached. She found herself looking forward to these stolen moments when she could speak freely with someone who seemed to understand the restlessness that consumed her. Donald never pressed her for details about her circumstances, but she sensed that he knew more than he let on. The turning point came on a bitter February night when she found him standing watch on the castle battlements. Snow swirled around them as she climbed the stone steps, drawn by an impulse she could not name. "You should not be here," he said without turning around. "The cold is fierce tonight." "I could not sleep." She moved to stand beside him at the wall, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. Sometimes I feel as if these walls are closing in on me. Marriage, Wendy said quietly. It was not a question. You know? The entire castle knows. Lord Carter has made no secret of his arrangements. Donald's jaw tightened. Jack Hernandez arrived yesterday to inspect his future bride. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known this day would come. But hearing it stated so bluntly made it real in a way that stole her breath. Inspect, she repeated bitterly, like livestock at market. Is that how you see it? How else should I see it? I am to be sold to pay my father's debts, with no say in the matter. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. I will spend the rest of my life pretending to be grateful for a comfortable prison. Donald turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, she could see something fierce burning in his eyes. And if you had a choice, what would you choose? I would choose to live, she said without hesitation, to feel something real, even if it meant risking everything. I would choose passion over safety, adventure over comfort. She looked at him directly. I would choose a man who looked at me like I was worth fighting for. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Snow continued to fall, dusting their shoulders and hair with white, but neither moved to seek shelter. Finally, Donald spoke, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to contain. Such choices are not without consequence. I know. Carolyn stepped closer to him, close enough to see the conflict playing out across his features. But living without choice is not truly living at all. Your father would lose everything. Your family would be ruined. My family is already ruined. We are simply delaying the inevitable while I pay the price. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his gloved hand. Tell me honestly, Sir Donald, if you were in my position, would you submit to such a fate? He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. No, I would fight. Even knowing you might lose everything? Especially then. His eyes met hers and she saw her own fierce longing reflected there. Some things are worth more than security or comfort. Some things are worth dying for. The moment stretched between them, electric and dangerous. Carolyn felt as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything forever. The smart thing would be to retreat, to return to her chambers and prepare for the life that had been chosen for her. Instead, she took that step forward. Then help me fight, she whispered. Donald's control cracked visibly. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. You do not know what you are asking. I know exactly what I am asking. She covered his hand with hers, holding his gaze. I am asking you to help me choose my own fate, whatever the cost. If we do this, there will be no going back. Carter will not forgive such defiance, and Hernandez will demand satisfaction. We would have to leave everything behind. I have nothing here worth keeping except my own soul. She leaned into his touch, feeling truly alive for the first time in months. Will you help me save it? His answer came not in words, but in the way he pulled her against him, his arms closing around her like a shield against the world. She felt the steady beat of his heart through his mail, the warmth of his body cutting through the winter cold, and knew that whatever came next, this moment would be worth it. We will need to be careful, he murmured against her hair. Carter has spies everywhere, and Hernandez is no fool. If they suspect what we are planning. What are we planning? She asked, pulling back to look at mine. To give you the choice you deserve. His gray eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. But the path will not be easy. Are you certain you are prepared for what it might cost? Carolyn thought of her mother fading away in a marriage that had slowly killed her spirit. She thought of all the women she had known who had disappeared into lives that were not their own, becoming shadows of who they might have been. Then she looked at Donald Kim, this dangerous knight who had somehow seen past her polite facade to the fire burning underneath, and knew her answer. I am prepared, she said firmly, whatever it takes. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of deception and planning. Carolyn played her part perfectly, appearing dutiful and resigned to her fate while secretly meeting with Donald to arrange their escape. They spoke in coded conversations during public gatherings, passed messages through Amy Kim, and used the castle's hidden passages to meet without detection. Jack Hernandez proved to be everything Carolyn had feared and worse. He was a soft man in his 40s with calculating eyes and hands that lingered too long when he touched her. He spoke of her as if she were a prize he had already won, discussing her future with Lord Carter as if she were not present. The way he looked at her made her skin crawl. But she endured his attention while counting the days until their planned departure. "He treats you like property," Donald observed one night as they met in the abandoned tower that had become their secret refuge. "Because that is what I am to him," Carolyn replied, settling beside him on the stone bench they had claimed as their own. "A valuable acquisition that will enhance his status and provide him with heirs. And after the wedding, I will be expected to be grateful for his generosity and spend my days managing his household while producing his children." She shuddered at the thought. "He has already made it clear that he expects complete obedience in all matters." Donald's hands clenched into fists. "The man is a fool if he thinks he can cage someone like you." "Someone like me? Strong, intelligent, fierce when cornered." He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You have more courage than most knights I have known." "I do not feel courageous. Most days I feel terrified that someone will discover what we are planning." "Fear and courage are not opposites," Donald said quietly. "The bravest people I know are those who act despite their fear, not those who feel no fear at all." Their plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. On the morning of the wedding, Donald would create a distraction that would allow Carolyn to slip away from the preparations. They would meet at the stables, where he would have horses ready, and flee together toward the borderlands, where his reputation would provide them some protection. "What happens after that?" Carolyn had asked during one of their planning sessions. "We disappear," Donald had replied. "New names, new lives. It will not be easy, but we will be free." "And you would give up everything for that? Your position, your reputation, your place here?" "My place here is temporary at best. Men like me do not retire peacefully to comfortable lives." He had touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "I have always known that I would die by the sword or disappear into obscurity. At least this way, the choice would be mine." As the wedding date approached, Carolyn found herself studying Donald with new eyes. She had initially been drawn to his dangerous appeal, the way he seemed to embody everything forbidden and exciting. But as she came to know him better, she discovered depths that surprised her. He was gentle with injured animals, patient with nervous horses, and showed unexpected kindness to the castle's servants. Beneath the fearsome reputation was a man of honor who had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control. The night before the wedding, they met one final time in their tower refuge. The moon was full, casting silver light through the narrow windows, and Carolyn felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a cloak. "Are you ready?" Donald asked, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "I have been ready since the moment I met you," she replied honestly. "You showed me that there was another way to live, even if I had not been brave enough to see it before. Tomorrow will change everything. Once we leave, there will be no safety net, no guarantee of what comes next." "I know." She moved closer to him, drawn by the gravity of their shared decision. "But whatever comes next, it will be our choice. That has to be worth something." Donald reached out to trace the line of her jaw with his fingertips, his touch reverent, despite the calluses earned through years of sword work. "You could still change your mind. Marry Hernandez, live the life that has been planned for you. It would be safer." "Safe," Carolyn repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "I am tired of safe. I want to live dangerously, at least once in my life." "With me?" His voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard before. "Especially with you." She covered his hand with hers, holding his gaze. "You are the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me, Donald Kim, and I would not have it any other time." The kiss that followed was inevitable, born from weeks of careful restraint and growing connection. His lips were warm against hers, and she could taste the promise of freedom in the way he held her, as if she were something precious and fragile that he was afraid to break. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, and Carolyn felt as if something fundamental had shifted in the world around them. Tomorrow, he whispered against her forehead. Tomorrow, she agreed, though part of her wished they could stay in this moment forever, suspended between the life she was leaving and the uncertain future they were choosing together. The wedding morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp winter light that made everything seem etched in crystal. Carolyn submitted to the ministrations of her attendants, allowing them to dress her in the elaborate gown that Hernandez had commissioned for the occasion. The silk was the color of cream, embroidered with gold thread and pearls, and it felt like a shroud around her shoulders. Amy Kim worked in careful silence, braiding flowers into Carolyn's hair while shooting meaningful glances toward the window. They had gone over the plan a dozen times, but Carolyn could see the fear in her maid's eyes. If they were caught, Amy would face punishment for her part in the deception. "You do not have to do this," Carolyn whispered when the other attendants had stepped away. "Yes, I do," Amy replied firmly. "You deserve the chance to choose your own path, my lady. And Sir Donald is a good man, whatever others might say about his reputation." The ceremony was to take place in the castle's Great Hall, with Lord Carter officiating and the entire household in attendance. As Carolyn made her way through the corridors toward what should have been her wedding, she felt strangely calm. The decision had been made, and now all that remained was to see it through. She could hear the murmur of voices from the Great Hall as guests took their places. Hernandez would be waiting at the altar, probably checking his appearance one final time and calculating the value of his new acquisition. Lord Carter would be preparing his speech about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of duty. None of them suspected that the bride had other plans. The distraction, when it came, was perfectly timed. A commotion erupted in the courtyard as Donald's men reported a breach in the castle's outer defenses, requiring immediate attention from the guards. In the confusion that followed, Carolyn slipped away from her escort and made her way through the servants' passages toward the stables. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted her skirts and ran through the narrow corridors, praying that no one would think to look for her until it was too late. The elaborate wedding gown was not designed for stealth or speed, but she managed to reach the stables without being detected. Donald was waiting with 2 horses saddled and ready, his own gear packed and secured. He had exchanged his ceremonial armor for practical traveling clothes, though he still wore his sword at his side. When he saw her, relief flooded his features. "I was beginning to think you had changed your mind," he said, helping her mount the smaller of the 2 horses. "Never," she replied, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. "Though I suspect we have only minutes before they realize I am missing." They rode hard through the castle gates, past guards who were too distracted by the supposed threat to pay them much attention. Once they reached the open road, Donald set a punishing pace that ate up the miles between them in pursuit. Carolyn's wedding dress billowed behind her like a banner of defiance, and she felt wild laughter bubbling up in her chest at the sheer audacity of what they had done. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when they heard the sound of hoofbeats behind them. Donald glanced back and cursed under his breath. "How many?" Carolyn called over the thunder of their horses' hooves. "Too many." His face was grim as he urged his mount to greater speed. "Carter must have discovered your absence sooner than we expected." The pursuit continued for miles, with their lead gradually shrinking as their horses began to tire. Carolyn could see the determination in Donald's face as he calculated distances and options, his tactical mind working even as they fled for their lives. "There," he said finally, pointing toward a dense patch of forest ahead. "If we can reach the trees, we might be able to lose them." They plunged into the woods just as the first arrows began to whistle past their heads. The forest provided cover, but also slowed their progress as they navigated between the trees. Behind them, they could hear Lord Carter's men crashing through the underbrush, their shouts echoing through the winter air. Donald led them deeper into the woods, following paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. His knowledge of the terrain was their only advantage now, and Carolyn trusted him completely as he guided them through the maze of trees and brambles. They finally stopped in a small clearing where a stream provided water for the horses. Both animals were lathered with sweat and breathing hard, and Carolyn knew they could not maintain this pace much longer. "We need to rest," she said, though she hated the delay. "I know." Donald was listening intently to the sounds of the forest around them. "But not for long. They will not give up easily." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Donald's hand went to his sword hilt, and Carolyn saw the transformation that came over him as he prepared for battle. This was the man who had earned his fearsome reputation, the knight who had never lost a fight. "They behind me," he ordered, dismounting and drawing his blade in one fluid motion. The first of Carter's men broke through the trees just as Donald stepped forward to meet them. What followed was a display of swordsmanship that took Carolyn's breath away. Donald moved like deadly poetry, his blades singing through the air as he parried and struck with precision born from years of combat. One by one, Carter's men fell before his skill, until only their leader remained. "Surrender, Sir Donald," the man called, though his voice shook with fear. "Lord Carter offers clemency if you return the lady unharmed." "Tell your lord that the lady made her choice," Donald replied, his sword steady in his grip. "And I have made mine." The final duel was brief but vicious. Carter's captain was skilled, but he was no match for Donald's combination of technique and determination. When it was over, the forest clearing was stained with blood, and Carolyn understood fully what it meant to be protected by a man like Donald Kim. "We need to move," he said, cleaning his blade before sheathing it. "More will come." They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and pursuit. When they finally stopped for the night, they were deep in the borderlands, far from the reach of Lord Carter's immediate influence. They made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a small stream, using their cloaks to create a windbreak against the cold. Donald tended to the horses while Carolyn gathered wood for a fire, both of them working in the comfortable silence that had developed between them during their flight. "Do you regret it?" Donald asked as they sat beside their small fire, sharing the simple provisions he had packed. "Which part? Running away from my wedding or choosing to trust a dangerous night with my life?" "Any of it, all of it." His gray eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. "Your life will be harder now. No comfortable castle, no certainty about where your next meal will come from." Carolyn considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she had left behind: the luxury of her chambers, the security of her position, the predictable rhythm of castle life. Then she looked at Donald, this man who had risked everything to give her a choice, and felt her answer settle into place like a key finding its lock. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly alive. Whatever hardships come, they will be ours to face together." "Together," he repeated as if testing the word. "I have not had a together in many years. What happened to make you so alone?" Donald was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I was born the second son of a minor lord. When my older brother died in a hunting accident, I should have inherited everything. Instead, my father's brother challenged my legitimacy and won. I was cast out with nothing but my sword and the clothes on my back." "How old were you?" 16. Old enough to fight, too young to understand that honor means little when gold is at stake. He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "I have been a sword for hire ever since, moving from one conflict to another, never staying long enough to form attachments. Until now." "Until now." He looked at her across the flames, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "You are the first person in years who has seen me as more than just a weapon to be wielded. You are so much more than that." Carolyn reached across the space between them to touch his hand. "You are kind and intelligent and honorable. You have shown me what it means to choose courage over comfort. And you have shown me what it means to have something worth fighting for beyond mere survival." His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the calluses earned through years of wielding a sword. "Whatever comes next, I want you to know that these past months have been the best of my life." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers while the stars wheeled overhead. Carolyn felt a peace she had never known before, despite the uncertainty of their situation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. The attack came just before dawn, when the sky was beginning to lighten, but the forest still held shadows. Carolyn woke to the sound of steel ringing against steel and found Donald locked in combat with 3 men wearing Lord Carter's colors. More were emerging from the trees, surrounding their small camp with practiced efficiency. "Run!" Donald shouted over the clash of weapons, but Carolyn could see that escape was impossible. They were outnumbered and surrounded, with nowhere to go. Instead of fleeing, she grabbed a burning branch from their dying fire and used it to drive back one of the attackers who was trying to flank Donald. The man cursed and stumbled backward, giving Donald the opening he needed to finish his current opponent. But there were too many of them, and both Carolyn and Donald were quickly overwhelmed. When Lord Carter himself stepped into the clearing, flanked by a dozen armed men, Carolyn knew their brief taste of freedom had come to an end. "Did you really think you could escape me so easily?" Carter asked, his pale eyes cold with fury. "Did you think I would allow such defiance to go unpunished?" Donald stepped protectively in front of Carolyn, his sword still in his hand despite being hopelessly outnumbered. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead, and she could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, but his stance remained defiant. "The lady made her choice freely," he said, his voice steady despite their circumstances. "The lady is a foolish child who does not understand the consequences of her actions," Carter snapped. "But she will learn, as will you, Sir Donald. I had hoped to avoid unpleasantness, but you have forced my hand." "What do you want?" Carolyn asked, stepping out from behind Donald's protective stance. "What I have always wanted, your obedience in your marriage to Jack Hernandez." Carter's smile was thin and cruel. "The ceremony will proceed as planned once we return to the castle. Your little adventure will be forgotten, and life will continue as it should. And Sir Donald will face the consequences of his treason." Carter's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "Unless, of course, you are willing to cooperate fully with my wishes." Carolyn felt the trap closing around them. Carter was offering her Donald's life in exchange for her submission, knowing that she would not be able to watch the man she loved die for her choices. It was a cruel but effective strategy, and they both knew it. "If I agree to marry Hernandez, you will let Sir Donald go free?" "I will allow him to leave my lands unharmed," Carter confirmed. "He will be banished, of course, but he will keep his life." Donald turned to look at her, and she saw the protest forming on his lips. Before he could speak, she shook her head slightly, hoping he would understand that she was not surrendering but buying time. "I need a moment to consider," she said. "You have until we return to the castle," Carter replied. "But know this, Lady Johnson. If you attempt to flee again, I will hunt you both down and ensure that your knight dies slowly and painfully. There will be no mercy a second time." The journey back to the castle was a nightmare of forced marches and constant surveillance. Carter's men surrounded them at all times, making communication impossible and escape unthinkable. Carolyn rode in silence, her mind racing as she tried to find some way out of the trap that had closed around them. Donald caught her eye whenever possible, and she could see him thinking as well, his tactical mind working on the problem of their situation. But surrounded by armed men, and with Carter watching their every move, their options were severely limited. When they finally reached the castle, news of their capture had already spread. Jack Hernandez waited in the courtyard, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. The assembled crowd included servants, guards, and guests who had remained for the spectacle of the runaway bride's return. "So," Hernandez said as Carolyn was helped down from her horse, "my bride returns. I trust this foolishness is now out of your system?" "The wedding will proceed immediately," Carter announced to the crowd. "Let this serve as a lesson about the consequences of defying lawful authority." Carolyn was escorted to her chambers under heavy guard, where her original wedding dress waited, along with a selection of attendants who had been chosen for their loyalty to Carter rather than to her. Amy Kim was nowhere to be seen, and Carolyn feared what might have happened to her faithful maid. As she was prepared for her second wedding attempt, Carolyn's mind raced through possibilities. The ceremony would take place in the Great Hall, with the entire household in attendance. Donald would likely be forced to watch, probably under guard, as a final humiliation before his banishment. But perhaps, in that crowd and confusion, there might be an opportunity. The Great Hall had been hastily redecorated for the ceremony, with flowers and banners attempting to create a festive atmosphere despite the underlying tension. Guests filled the benches, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease at the dramatic events that had unfolded. Carolyn was escorted to the altar where Jack Hernandez waited, his possessive smile making her skin crawl. Lord Carter stood ready to officiate, his pale eyes holding a warning that she dared not ignore. Behind him, she could see Donald under heavy guard, his hands bound, but his gray eyes burning with barely contained fury. "Dearly beloved," Carter began, his voice carrying across the hall, "we are gathered here to witness the union of Jack Hernandez and Lady Carolyn Johnson in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Carolyn like a tide, and she felt herself disconnecting from the moment as a survival mechanism. This was not her real wedding, she told herself. Her real wedding had taken place in a forest clearing beside a dying fire, with only the stars as witnesses and a dangerous night as her chosen partner. "Do you, Jack Hernandez, take Lady Carolyn Johnson to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Hernandez replied, his grip on her hand possessive and uncomfortable. "And do you, Lady Carolyn Johnson, take Jack Hernandez to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was the moment. Carolyn could feel the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, waiting for her response. She could give Carter what he wanted, submit to the marriage and save Donald's life. She could play the part of the obedient daughter and disappear into a life that was not her own. Instead, she thought about her mother fading away in a marriage that had slowly killed her spirit. She thought about all the women who had come before her, sacrificing their dreams on the altar of duty and expectation. And she thought about Donald Kim, who had shown her what it meant to choose courage over comfort. "No," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "I do not." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Hernandez's face turned purple with rage, Carter's hand went to his sword, and the assembled guests erupted in shocked murmurs. But Carolyn only had eyes for Donald, whose expression showed a mixture of pride and terror at what she had just done. "You will answer correctly," Carter hissed, stepping closer to her, "or watch your knight die where he stands." "Then you will have to kill us both," Carolyn replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Because I will not marry this man, no matter what threats you make." The standoff stretched for endless moments, with the entire hall holding its breath. Then Donald spoke, his voice carrying clearly despite his bound hands. "She has made her choice," he said, "and I stand with her, whatever the consequences." Carter's control finally snapped. With a snarl of rage, he drew his sword and advanced on Carolyn, clearly intending to end the defiance once and for all. But he had underestimated the effect of Carolyn's courage on those around them. The first person to move was Amy Kim, who appeared from behind a pillar with a dagger in her hand. Then several of the younger knights stepped forward, their loyalties shifting in the face of Carter's obvious tyranny. Even some of the servants began to murmur disapproval at the sight of their lord threatening an unarmed woman. In the chaos that followed, Donald somehow freed himself from his bonds and fought his way to Carolyn's side. The great hall erupted into violence as loyalties divided and old grievances surfaced. Carter found himself facing not just two defiant lovers, but a growing rebellion among his own people. The battle was fierce but brief. Carter's remaining loyal men were outnumbered by those who had been pushed too far by his tyrannical rule. When the dust settled, Lord Carter lay dead on the stones of his own great hall, killed by the very people he had oppressed for so long. Jack Hernandez had fled at the first sign of violence, abandoning his claim to both bride and dowry in his haste to escape. Carolyn found herself standing in the ruins of what should have been her wedding, surrounded by the debris of a life she had never wanted. "What happens now?" she asked Donald, who stood beside her with his sword still drawn, blood on his armor but victory in his eyes. "Now we choose," he replied, sheathing his blade and taking her hand. "We can stay and help rebuild this place, or we can leave and make our own way in the world. The choice is ours." Carolyn looked around the great hall, seeing the faces of people who had risked everything to support her moment of defiance. Amy Kim stood nearby, grinning despite the cut on her cheek. The younger knights who had joined their cause looked to them for leadership. Even the servants seemed to stand taller, as if the fall of their oppressive lord had freed something in their spirits. "I think," Carolyn said slowly, "that we have work to do here. These people deserve better than they have had, and perhaps we can help give it to them." Donald smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something beautiful. "Together? Always together." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as a warrior, but also the gentleness that made him so much more. "Though I should warn you, life with me will probably be dangerous." I would not have it any other way, he replied, pulling her into his arms as the crowd around them cheered. Later, as they stood on the castle battlements, watching the sun set over the lands that were now free from tyranny, Carolyn reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, facing a future that felt like a living death. She had ended as someone who had chosen her own path, no matter the cost. Do you ever regret it? Donald asked, echoing his question from their first night of freedom. Choosing the dangerous path? Carolyn thought about everything they had been through, the risks they had taken, the prices they had paid. Then she looked at the man beside her, this knight who had shown her what it meant to live with courage and purpose, and felt her answer settle into place with absolute certainty. Never, she said firmly. I chose you, and I chose freedom, and I would make the same choice again every day for the rest of my life. Donald Kim had looked like sin on a warhorse when she first saw him, dangerous and forbidden and everything she had been taught to avoid. Now she knew that sometimes sin was just another word for salvation, and that the most dangerous choice could also be the one that set you free. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Carolyn Johnson stood with her chosen knight and felt truly alive for the first time in her life. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility, and she would meet it with courage, with love, and with the knowledge that she had chosen her own fate. The choice had been hers, and she had chosen well.